Once upon a time, there was a boy who loved to look at the night sky. Clyde Tombaugh was born on a farm in Illinois at the turn of the 20th century. At the age of 12, he discovered telescopes and the stars, and this began a lifelong love of studying the night sky. And he dreamed that one day he would go to college and become an astronomer. Well, Thomas's parents were wheat farmers, and they moved the family out to Kansas to try their luck at farming there. But unfortunately, their luck was not good. When Clyde was a young man and still dreaming of going to college, a hailstorm came along and trampled the family's crops like flats, wrecking the harvest and Clyde's plans both at the same time. No crops meant no money, meant no college. But it didn't mean the end of Clyde's love of stars or of his desire to know. So Clyde Tombaugh dug a pit, like you do. He dug a really big pit. It was 24 feet long, it was 7 feet wide, it was 8 feet deep. He dug it all by himself with just a shovel and a pick. That is a seriously big hole. And Clyde dug the hole because he needed a place with a constant cool temperature and no wind disturbances so he could do the next thing he wanted to do, which was to build his own telescope with discarded farm machinery and old car parts based on a design he found in a magazine. It was a good hole. His parents used it as a root cellar. It was a good telescope. Clyde used it to observe Jupiter and Mars, and he made drawings of those planets. He sent those drawings off to Lowell Observatory in 1929, and the astronomers there were so impressed with his drawings that they immediately offered him a job. It was a small job. It was a little thing. They wanted him to help them find a planet. You see, back then, scientists knew there were 8 planets in our solar system, and if you could help me name them, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. They suspected there was a 9th planet hiding somewhere way out there because there was a little wobble in the orbit of Neptune, just the littlest wobble that shouldn't be there. And they thought that the gravity of a hidden planet way out among the stars was giving Neptune like a little interstellar tug and causing that wobble in its orbit. They thought they knew roughly where in the night sky the planet might be. They called it Planet X. They'd been looking for it for 25 years. Clyde's job was to find it. So to look for it, Clyde used what's called a blink camera. The way this works is he pointed one of the giant telescopes at a tiny, tiny piece of the starry night sky. He then took 2 pictures of the stars in that night sky just a few days apart. So imagine a picture of the night sky with thousands and thousands and thousands of little dots. Each dot is a star in the sky. Now, when Clyde would press a button, the blink camera would go back and forth rapidly between the 2 images that he had taken. And over the course of a couple of days, if one of those dots was a planet, it would move relative to the other stars. The other stars, because they're so far away, would not move. So the dot, if it were a planet, would appear to jump just a little bit between the 2 images. You don't need to understand all the details. You just need to know that Clyde had to figure out the best place and the best way to take a picture of the night sky. And then he had to slowly, carefully scrutinize every single dot on that picture, thousands and thousands of dots, flipping the images back and forth, looking for a dot that jumps. It was a lot of looking. Hours and hours, days and days, months and months, almost a year of looking. So much looking. Clyde had to use his intelligence to pick out the best places and time to take pictures. And he had to learn how to manage all that looking, how to take breaks, how to rest his eyes and his brain from scrutinizing thousands and thousands and thousands of dots. It must have been even more boring than digging the pit. But somewhere on the other side of all that work was a planet, and Clyde was determined to find it. And one day in 1930, he did. On February 18th, 1930, a little dot jumped, and Clyde Tombaugh knew he had found the missing planet. He didn't have any formal training, he didn't have a college degree, but he had succeeded where all others had failed because of his determination and his persistence. He walked from his telescope to the room where all the other scientists were, and he coolly said, I have found your planet X. And today we call it Pluto, and here it is, if the tech team would like to share the image. Clyde Tombaugh's planet X. It even has a heart on it. After finding Pluto, Clyde went on to college and then back to the observatory to continue studying the night sky. He later said, "Only a few people have seen as much of the universe as I have." In his life, he looked at literally millions of stars. He discovered hundreds of asteroids, he cataloged thousands of galaxies, and he helped us learn how they are distributed across the universe. In his spare time, he helped found a new Unitarian church in New Mexico, which is today the UU Church of Las Cruces, New Mexico, because Clyde Tombaugh was also a Unitarian Universalist. And inside that church, there's a giant stained glass window celebrating the discovery of Pluto. It's called the Clyde Tombaugh window. Clyde wanted to help create a church that would celebrate learning and wonder and looking, and that is what he did. In Unitarian Universalism, we teach our children and youth to question, to explore, to challenge assumptions, to shine the light of their reason and imagination into the hidden corners of the world, and to create new things out of their own unique spirit. And those values bring us to today's special ceremony. At our annual Blessing of the Backpacks, we acknowledge that our children are, at this time of year, embarking on a new cycle of learning and growth. We honor the task they are undertaking, and we want them to know they have the support of this community. We also want to acknowledge those of you who are teachers and educators and the wonderful work you do in supporting and fostering learning. On Backpack Blessing Sunday every year, it is traditional for the service to celebrate the place of reason, science, and learning in our living tradition that is Unitarian Universalism. So today I wanted to offer up the stories of three 20th century Unitarian Universalist scientists whose story every UU should know, in my humble opinion. We started with Clyde Tombaugh, and now I want to tell you about a scientist named Cecilia Payne Poshkin. Cecilia Payne Poshkin was born Cecilia Payne in 1900 in England. She was a fiercely intelligent person who loved learning, looking, and questioning. As a young girl, she saw a meteorite streak across the sky, and that was it for her. She knew what she wanted to do. It sparked a lifelong passion for astronomy. When she was sent to religious schools as a child, she faked fainting spells to get out of prayer and Bible class so she could devote more time to her exploration. Eventually, as a young adult, she attended Cambridge. There she heard a lecture by Stanley Eddington about the world-famous expedition, where he provided the first observational proof of Einstein's general theory of relativity. She recalls that after hearing that lecture, she did not sleep for 3 days, and she had something like a nervous breakdown as she worked out the implications for general relativity for our view of the world. She completed her course of studies at Cambridge, but was not awarded a degree because Cambridge at that time did not give degrees to women. So at 23, Payne left England for America because it was simply not possible for a woman to pursue astronomy in England at that time. It was not particularly easy in America either, but Payne wrote the director of the observatory at Harvard, who she had met, and he encouraged her to join a new program that they were starting there, and she quickly became one of its most brilliant students. In 1925, Cecilia Payne became the first woman to earn a PhD in astronomy from Radcliffe College at Harvard University. Her PhD thesis was on the chemical composition of the stars, and one astronomer called it the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. Payne had applied cutting-edge physics to her own careful measurements to conclude that the sun was primarily composed of hydrogen. At the time, it was the commonly accepted scientific idea that the stars and the planets were essentially composed of the same stuff in the same proportion. The sun, of course, was just much, much hotter. Payne showed no, the sun was mostly hydrogen. In fact, scientists had underestimated the amount of hydrogen by a factor of about 1 million. This meant the prevailing theory was spectacularly wrong, and also that hydrogen was the most abundant element in the universe. The other astronomers were not prepared for their theories to be so spectacularly wrong. And so one particularly prestigious and very powerful astronomer, the kind who could make or break a young person's career, leaned on Payne and convinced her that she must be mistaken, and she was encouraged not to press the point in her thesis. So in her thesis regarding the superabundance of hydrogen, she basically said, here are my results, but I don't believe them. It will shock you to learn that shortly thereafter, that very same astronomer who convinced her not to stand by her results drew the same conclusion by different means, published his findings, and got the credit for the discovery. He did at least have the courtesy to give a perfunctory nod to her work in his paper, but it would be decades before she got the full credit for her discovery. Of the debacle, Payne would later say, I was to blame for not having pressed my point. I had given in to authority when I believed I was right. She says, this is another example of how not to do research. I note it as a warning to the young. If you are sure of your facts, you should defend your position. Now, Payne continued doing scientific work at Harvard for her entire career. Women at that time were not allowed to become professors, so she spent most of her time relegated to low-paying work and less prestigious research assistant positions. It was difficult for women to get access to observatories where they could make their own recordings because it was considered unseemly for a woman to be alone overnight in a telescope with a bunch of men. In one letter about her difficulties, she noted acidly that while she herself taught, her lectures were not listed in the Harvard catalogs, and because she could not be paid as an instructor, she was paid for as equipment. Nonetheless, despite many slights and difficulties, Payne did groundbreaking research in the chemical composition of stars. That research is now foundational to all later work in the field. Her husband, Sergei Poshkin, who was also an astronomer, she helped him escape from the Soviet Union, actually, and they did research together as a couple. Finally, after multiple interventions on her behalf by colleagues, in 1956, Cecilia Payne Poshkin became the first woman to be promoted to full professor at Harvard. She would ultimately become the chair of the astronomy department, making her the first woman to head a department at Harvard. She's remembered by a former student as an imposing personality, known for her wit, her literary knowledge, and her personal friendship with individual stars. She could effortlessly intersperse scientific arguments with quotes from Gilbert and Sullivan, T.S. Eliot, and Latin verse. She was a member of the First Parish UU Church in Lexington, Massachusetts. She taught in the RE program there, and her children all grew up in the RE program there. As a young person, Payne used to call her laboratory her chapel, saying that there she conducted a little worship service of her own. In Unitarian Universalism, she found a religious home that shared her sense of reverence in encountering the natural world, and her conviction that curiosity, questioning, and discovery were their own forms of worship. Cecilia Payne Poshkin died in 1979. In 1977, she was awarded the highest honor of the American Astronomical Society, the Henry Norris Russell Lectureship Award, named ironically after the guy who stole the credit for her discovery. In her acceptance speech, Payne said, "The reward of the young scientist is the emotional thrill of being the first person in the history of the world to see something or to understand something." She said, "Nothing can compare with that experience." And the reward of the old scientist, she said, is the sense of having seen a vague sketch grow into a masterly landscape. But elsewhere, Cecilia Payne also said, "Do not undertake a scientific career in quest of fame or money. There are easier and better ways to reach them. Undertake it only if nothing else will satisfy you, for nothing else is probably what you will receive." Perhaps she was speaking from experience there. So Unitarian Universalism is a religious tradition that inspires and encourages trailblazing figures. And so we can't claim a lot of firsts in our panoply of UU saints, right? First women ordained minister, first woman doctor, first woman professor at Harvard, and so on and so on. And we tell their stories as inspiring tales of courage, and they are. But one of the things that I want to lift up in the story of Cecilia Payne is that being the trailblazing first is frequently a lousy place to find yourself. Right? For most of her career, she got little credit, little prestige, little money, having to fight barrier after barrier, and she felt the sting of that. Her courage is inspiring, deeply inspiring, and also that is not a reasonable thing to ask of someone. We cannot expect progress to come from the heroism of ordinary people paying extraordinary prices. If Payne, as a young woman, ultimately backed down from claiming her own discovery, and who can blame her, how many promising careers of brilliant women were demolished entirely before they even got started? And how often is this still happening to young people in different contexts, in subtle and not so subtle ways? Too often in all walks of life, it is left to marginalized or oppressed or powerless people to push through for their own liberation at considerable pain and cost. And this is why it is so imperative for all of us to fight for all of us. And for those of us with the most privilege, for whom it is the easiest to leave these battles to others, pretend that they don't need to be fought, it is imperative for those of us to speak up. This is especially true at this time when educators are under siege in this country. And young people who would be critical thinkers may find the books they need access to banned and the classroom conversations shut down. There are many ways to silence the critical mind and the questioning voice. As it ever was, courage and conviction is needed from all of us. It cannot be left to the brave few. Our third and final UU scientist we are celebrating today is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a naturalist, popular science writer, a scientist, a journalist, and ultimately one of the most consequential citizen activists of the 20th century. Her book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, helped launch the modern environmental movement. Carson documented the overuse of the chemical spraying of pesticides and the destructive consequences to ecosystems and potential danger to humans. Her book was an instant bestseller, and while she was prepared for critique and controversy, she was not prepared for the extent to which she was personally attacked, even vilified for her conclusions. Silent Spring was written while Carson was herself dealing with an advanced stage of cancer. Getting it finished and out into the world was a furious race against the progression of her own illness. In between debilitating daily rounds of chemotherapy, she would deliver fresh revisions to her chief editor and research assistant, a fellow UU named Jeannie David. In the last 2 years of her life, she devoted the remnants of her remarkable energy to sharpening her arguments, to making her case, rebutting her critics, testifying in Congress and on the public stage, doing the utmost with every breath she had remaining to defend the natural world she loved so much. She died in 1964, just 2 years after publishing Silent Spring. Carson's inner life, her remarkable courage, was nourished by her sense of joy and wonder and curiosity about the natural world. Before writing Silent Spring, Carson was a zoologist working for the Fish and Wildlife Services. In the 1950s, she wrote 3 popular books about the ocean that highlighted her ability, in the words of Lisa Sedaris, to translate scientific data into magic and enchantment. Carson herself said that if there was poetry in her writing about the sea, it was not because she put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. Carson was a scientist who sought to make the best case she could from reason and data, the tools of the scientific trade, but her own remarkable strength and courage came from that poetry. She wrote, "To stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist moving over a great salt marsh, to watch the flight of shorebirds that have swept up and down the surf lines of the continent for untold thousands of years, To see the running of the old eels and the young shads to the sea is to have knowledge of things that are nearly as eternal as any earthly life can be. Today, 60 years after the publication of Silent Spring, we have made remarkable strides in cleaning up the waters and cleaning up the air, thanks in large part to the movement that she inspired. And yet, as we all know, the natural world today faces greater threats than any Carson could ever have imagined. But Carson knew that if we are to have the resilience, the fortitude, and the faithfulness to protect and preserve our world, our actions need to be grounded in something more than self-interest, even self-preservation. We need to be grounded in beauty and reverence, in that poetry, in heartfelt connection, in a sense of the sacredness of the world and the sacredness of the task before us. At the end of her life, as Rachel Carson was testifying before Congress about the dangers of pesticides and fending off attacks from chemical companies and working to get her message out, she was also working on another book. This was not a book about politics or policy or activism. It was a book for parents and children, specifically about preserving and rekindling our capacity to feel joy and wonder and reverence in our personal encounter with the natural world. The book was published posthumously under the title The Age of Wonder. And in it, Carson wrote, "If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow. The years of early childhood are the time to prepare that soil. Once the emotions have been aroused, a sense of the beautiful, the excitement of the new and unknown, a feeling of sympathy, pity, admiration, or love, then we wish for knowledge about the object of our emotional response." She said, "It is our misfortune that for most of us, that clear-eyed vision, that true instinct for what is beautiful and awe-inspiring is dimmed or even lost before we reach adulthood." Our tradition of Unitarian Universalism urges us to hold fast to beauty and wonder, to keep fresh and vital our connection to the spirit of life all around us that stirs our minds and opens our hearts and calls to something in the soul of scientists and poets and citizen activists alike, and calls to us. So may we keep observing, keep asking, keep looking, keep wondering, for that is how we grow our understanding and grow our souls, grow our capacity for reverence and our courage to defend that which is sacred. As Unitarian Universalists, this is who we are. This is who we are called to be. May we encourage and support one another, young and old alike, in this lifelong journey.